So I guess we're ready to start. Hello, everyone. My name is Ali Al-Khayat, and I'm a surgical resident in the Kuwaiti Board of Surgery and a member of Surg Kuwait. Today, we're having our third session of the ABCs of Research series, and we'll be focusing on how to write a paper for publication. Before we start, I would like to remind everyone about our webinar series. We have our Surgical Fix series, the Surgical Debate, and our new upcoming series, the Plastic Surgery Foundation course, which will be an interactive online course made of 8 webinars. It will be starting this Saturday, and it is CME accredited by the American College of Surgeons. So I'm gonna post the links in the chat below, so make sure you register for them. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Sarah Lyohe. For those joining the series for the first time, Dr. Sarah is a consultant plastic surgeon working at Jaber Al-Ahmed Hospital. She's a graduate of University of Manchester, and she completed her residency and fellowship in breast reconstruction and aesthetic breast surgery from Dalhousie University in Canada. Dr. Sarah, welcome back again.
Thank you so much for having me back, and thank you for everyone who's joining us. If you've been with us from the beginning till now, kudos to you. You've been very patient with the whole process. So some of you might know, this part will be focused about the writing process for a paper. And yeah, we'll get going. Sorry, sometimes the screen. So we have one more remaining talk in the series, which is going to be how to publish research. So going through the actual process of submitting a paper. So today it's very simple. We're going to be talking about the preparation process for writing the paper. Then we'll go into how the writing process works, and then I'll just talk about a few hints and tips for troubleshooting issues that usually arise during the process. If you have any questions, again, please post them in the Q&A, and happy to answer any questions then. So first part, preparation. So I think fundamentally, this is the most important part of the entire process. We touched upon it in the first talk, which was critical appraisal, and really important to choose the right research question and to formulate it properly, because everything will fall into place once you have these things. How do I even come up with a research question? Some people might ask. So the best research questions address real clinical problems, and you can find these problems if you're driven by curiosity in your day-to-day practice. So as if you're a clinician, you're actually quite lucky, because in your day-to-day practice, you encounter things that might, harbor unanswered questions that you can design a research paper around. So I would encourage you to be inquisitive whenever you're doing something in your practice. Ask why, and if there isn't a good answer in the literature, it's an opportunity to come up with a new research question, and always challenge assumptions. There's things we do in our day-to-day practice that are simple: dressings, drains, do you shower after surgery? Patients ask you questions. And if we've been doing something the same way for a while, just challenge it. Why are we doing it this way? Has anyone actually studied this? Because you'd be surprised how many of these basic things that we don't actually have a good scientific basis for. And when you choose a research question, I would suggest that you go through this framework, which is called the Pgh Framework, to determine whether this question is even worth answering. F is it feasible? For example, does this need a big RCT that requires $3 million of funding? Am I able to get that? If not, then it might not be worth you pursuing. It might be for someone else. Is it interesting? Is it interesting not just to you, but to a wider audience? So a good way to test that is to ask people, do you think this would be interesting in your day-to-day practice? And also, if you are in a particular field, let's say urology, I'd encourage you to read articles from the main journals and see, is this a topic that people are looking at? Like, is it current? Is it topical? And is it novel? There's no point doing something if once you do your literature review, the answer has been questioned definitively. So it's really important before you embark on any big research project to check that it has novelty. Is it ethical? If we wanted to do an RCT looking at is breast milk better than formula, some people might say it's unethical because we have enough information to know that that's not good for the other babies. So important to do that, and then to go, that would help you get your ethical approval. And is it relevant? Are people gonna care? You could answer a question that even if you find something that is a positive finding, it might not even matter because it doesn't make a difference clinically. Once you go through that, you need to formulate your question properly. And this is where we go back to PICO that we talked about in our first lecture series, okay? So your question has to include a relevant population that's very well defined, because we can't do research on everyone in the world. So you have to limit it to geography, a particular age group, a particular disease group. Then you have to have an intervention and a comparison, because usually when we're doing research projects, we have to compare something to something. Not always. Sometimes we have qualitative research, case series, case reports, but it has to be clear for you from the start what's your target goal with this research question. And always for outcome again. So once we compare these two things, what are we looking at? What's our outcome of interest going to be? Then I would suggest you write a research proposal once you have your idea. This is good for many reasons. One, it helps you focus your brain on what you're trying to do and design your research properly. Number two, you need a research proposal to submit to ethics or to submit it for a grant. So once you have your research proposal ready, it makes paper writing easier, it makes grant proposal easier, ethical approval easier. So it's a good place to start. And I suggest if you're from Kuwait to follow the KFAS format, which is available in their KFAS grant manual, which if you just go KFAS grant manual in Google, it will come up as a PDF. If you're from other countries, I would suggest your main funding body, just use their format. And KFAS's format is very simple. You have introduction, objectives, what's your methodology, what are your expected research outcomes, and then references, okay? And if you want to be very organized, I would suggest you even plan your results section ahead of time. So envision what your tables are going to look like, see the end before you get to the end, because then everything is a lot more organized and deliberate. Once you do that, you should submit for ethical approval. So in Kuwait, that goes to the ethics committee in the Ministry of Health. And you complete a form. I'll show you what it's like for those of you who don't know, and you attach your research proposal to it. Usually it's a requirement if you have any consent forms or data collection forms to include them. Consent forms need to be both in Arabic and English in Kuwait, and you just attach those. So this is what the ethics form looks like. You can either ask one of your colleagues to forward it to you, or you can get it from the Ministry of Health itself. So you have to physically go there or text somebody there, and they will send you this PDF, which you are expected to complete briefly. And then you're expected to attach your research proposal and then hand it back to them, okay? And there's multiple ways you can also call or email if you had any questions. And, the submitted proposals are reviewed by the ethics committee, who I know meet on a regular basis. If your proposal is interventional or has some complexity, then what they do is then they forward your proposal to relevant bodies. So for example, if your research is based on, something microbiological and involves taking specimens or giving interventions, they might send it to people in the university with expertise in this area for their opinion. And this might sometimes take a while because it's out of the ethics committee hands how long those people take to respond to them. If your proposal is very straightforward with minimal potential harm, then it tends to be done quickly. So for example, if your study is purely retrospective without any intervention with minimal risk, it tends to get a response pretty quickly, okay? After that, you can decide whether you need to apply for a grant or funding, okay? This varies per country. In Kuwait, your main funding sources could be KFAS or even industry. So you can ask companies if they would do an industry-sponsored trial. And if you initiated, it would be considered an investigator-initiated industry-sponsored trial. So if you wanted to do a study on a device, let's say in robotics, you can ask the company if they would, the company itself, and in this case, it would be the mother company, such as Johnson & Johnson, not necessarily the local company, if they would sponsor it, and they'll usually ask you to send them the proposal. And then if they like the idea, they might fund the consumables for your study. I know this is what we did for our RCT. It was industry sponsored. KFAS is different. So KFAS, it's an open competition 2 to 4 times per year. I think usually it's advertised on their website. I would suggest you follow them on social media like Twitter, because once they announce it, at least you'll get an alert. I'd advise you to read the instructions on the KFAS grant manual very carefully, because that's how they expect you to submit it. You submit the actual application online through their online system, and then you attach your proposal again. Smaller grant, if you ask for money, let's say less than 17,500 KD, you tend to get a response quickly. Other things that I've heard can help you get your approval better is if you ask for small sums, and if you have an external collaborator such as prestigious university, it definitely helps your grant get approved quicker. If you're requesting big sums of money, and the threshold I think is 17,500 KD, then it goes to an external reviewer. So it could be someone in any university, say University of Minnesota. So that takes time. So it might take you a long time to hear back, sometimes over 6 months. And the reason for that is the reviewers have to give you a score, and then they make a recommendation. So you get a letter back from them saying you got, let's say, 93 out of 100 from reviewer 1, and they recommended no funding, or they recommend funding with revisions, or they recommend no funding. So, and then you get a final response from KFAS, and then KFAS would channel the money to you, either through the university if you're based there, or through MOH, and that's how you'd receive the funding. So they channel through these means. Before starting, I would also suggest that this is one thing that I've noticed, that some people who embark on a research project, they do everything brilliantly, and then their data collection is very disorganized. So you get an Excel sheet with data that's all over the place and not formatted correctly, and then you have to spend a lot of time cleaning that data. So I would suggest, if you're going to do anything that involves data collection, that you use data collection forms, and that you design the forms properly to limit the data entry. Because if you're receiving automated data, it's less prone to error. If you're depending on humans to fill in fields for you, then you need to put constraints. And what I mean by constraints is, if you're going to put people's civil ID number in a form, you should put constraints such as, if it's more or less than 12 digits, an error comes up for the user. So you don't allow them to make those human errors. Many options for this. You can use REDCap, and for REDCap, you need it to be approved through a university or a health institution. So you need institutional approval for that, and you can apply online. It's free. I've seen people have good success with Google Forms. It's a good platform, but be careful if you're going to put data that, you know, in terms of patient confidentiality, it's not HIPAA compliant. So the sort of data you should put there should not contain sensitive information. And then there's Survey CTO, which I used. It was free during COVID, but I think it has a price point now, but it worked very well. And there's many, many other things in the market. You just have to pick something that, one, you're comfortable with, and two, you're able to use the technology. So Some of these forms, you need to have some programming background, and some of them are simpler to use. So just things to think about when you're planning. Okay, so that's in terms of preparation and getting geared up. And now you've done your project, you've collected the data, you've analyzed it, and it's time to write it up, which is everybody's favorite part. Not really, but yeah, we have to do it because there's no point doing research if you're not going to write it up. So before we even embark on our writing project, besides doing a lot of research to get better and better at it, because every time you do more things, you're going to get better at it. It's a good idea to just read a lot. Okay. So if you haven't already, if you have core journals in your field, okay, for example, in plastic surgery, I know there's 4 core journals, PRS, Aesthetic Surgery Journal, Aesthetic Plastic Surgery, these are the top 3 journals, so subscribe to them. Now it's easy. You can use social media. You can have apps that can collect the table of contents for you. And you should read the type of articles they're publishing if you want to publish there. So this is a case of know your audience. So if you understand your journals, what kind of stuff they like to publish, how they format it, it will make it much easier for you to write because you understand what they're looking for. Okay. You can join their emailing list, so they'll send you, it's only once a month. Just have a read through how things are written and what are the topics that they're looking for. You can also use research summaries that are available, journal clubs, conferences. All these things will give you a better sense of what journals are looking for and what type of research they like. So if you see a research and most of the research is, not as international, just something to think about. Because I know a lot of people, when they do research, it's very focused on Kuwait, for example. So this might not appeal to an international audience. So you have to phrase your research to meet their needs too. And one thing I have to say about writing is it's good to practice writing and to write a lot, because writing well is basically thinking clearly, and that's why it's hard. And you're writing to an audience. So you're not just reporting a study, you're trying to sell a story. And scientific writing is basically joining, some people say, a scholarly conversation. So imagine that you're talking to all the people in your field and trying to engage with them in a two-way process. And most of you know this, we have the general format, which is the IMRAD format. Most articles will have an introduction, methods, results, and discussion, and we'll dive into each of those in detail in terms of how to write. So the introduction. So the introduction is, the whole point of the introduction is to sell your research question and your methodology to the reader. You want people to, as they read in your introduction, say, oh yeah, someone really needs to study this and they really need to do it this way because clearly this is a huge problem, and then present your aims and methods. So you want to lead them through the path where then you present them with, guess what, guys, this is exactly what we did. And this framework is called the Pgh Framework, which is you present the problem, then you highlight what is the gap, and then your hook is like, guess what, this is what we're going to do. So this is why you should read this paper. So instead of just trying to summarize everything, you're trying to sell what you're doing. And again, so the problem, you would start with, you wouldn't necessarily the problem is, but you'll say, for example, we have so much COVID research now. COVID is such a big problem and people are dying. Then you explain what we know already. So it's a nod to the known. So what we know is that, vaccines are popular and lots of people are getting vaccinated. The gap is what we don't know is. So for example, it could be, but we don't know if the vaccines work for the Delta variant. And the hook is, and this matters because lots of people who are vaccinated are dying from this. So we need to do something about it. So the aim of my research is to blah, blah, blah. So you've sold the entire process to your audience. And this is just an example. So is the COVID example. Another example could be, we have multi-resistant bacteria because antibiotics are overprescribed. What we know is that in surgery, we give a lot of prophylactic antibiotics after surgery. What we don't know could be, we don't know if these antibiotics actually help, and no one has studied it. So your hook could be that, since no one has done an RCT to look at this, then we want to determine this by carrying out an RCT to study this. So that's the general idea. So you can even do it as 4 paragraphs when you're writing your introduction. And to weave the story and to build it up, you need to review your literature. It's really important to know the literature and what is the gap in knowledge that we have. So you need to summarize what we know and then explain to your audience what's missing. Okay, a lot of people I've seen, they just summarize papers like a textbook, like this is everything we know and here's my aims, and that's not how it should be. Highlighting what we don't know is actually more important than stating what we already know about a topic, because again, this is not a textbook. And there's many types of research gaps. So this is something to think about. Is there a deficit? Am I studying something that no one has studied before? Is there a shortcoming? Are most of the studies retrospective and no one has carried out an RCT, so I'm going to do that? Is there a controversy? For example, no one has reached a consensus on whether drains are useful after breast reduction. And then the last one, it's assumption. So if there's a dogma or something that we're always doing, for example, abscesses, we always leave to heal by secondary intention after an IND. However, some people might think this is harmful. So because there is an assumption, the purpose of this research is, for example, to challenge that assumption. So once you've decided on your literature review, it's important to identify keywords. Okay, how do you identify the keywords? You can brainstorm them. You can ask your co-authors to help you. And ideally, sorry about the typo there, you can ask a librarian to help you perform a systematic search. This is not going to be the same search you would do in a systematic review, but you still have to have a specific method, because the whole point is to choose high impact, relevant, recent articles to help tell your story. You shouldn't reference articles generally as a rule of thumb that are more than 5 to 10 years ago, because they're irrelevant. There's more recent articles that state something. So I think it's important to look at what journals the literature is in and how recent it is. Once you read these articles, you need to have a sense of what they're claiming so that you can piece the whole thing together. So one tip I would give is, I use this when I first started, is use Post-it notes. And if you're not a paper person, you can make digital Post-it notes. So let's say I've identified 20 key articles that I think need to be referenced. What you do is, if you print it out, or if you're doing this digitally, then for each article, you can stick a Post-it note and you put the title, the authors, and just in 2 or 3 sentences, what are the key takeaways? What's the key method and what did they find out? Once you have 20 Post-it notes, you can group them. So these say this, these say this, these say this, and it just helps you organize your thoughts and helps you group key articles together. Because, articles that say the same thing, when I make a statement, I might want to use 2 or 3 references. Once you link your citation together, make sure it conveys a message. Don't just, again, put random articles in your introduction. You need to, the whole point of your citation is to represent your source of knowledge. What I've seen some people do is the first paragraphs, they make 3 statements and they don't reference it and they say it very factually. And you can't do that. You have to, every sentence in your article has to have a reference. You can't say lung cancer is a big problem. It's not scientific. You need to say, you need to have specific facts and you have to reference those facts. And then make sure that that knowledge is placed in relation to other existing knowledge. So here, I'm not going to read these, but in terms of citations, I've put and then you can look back on this. Verbs that allow you to position your statements together. So once you have your articles, these are words that might help you string them together. So, from things that are neutral to articles that are making the same case as you, or articles that are challenging you. So you can say comments, explains, notes, describes, suggests. So you'd say, so-and-so et al. Noted that using drains after, I don't know, cholecystectomy is beneficial. However, so-and-so contends that this is not the case because. So these words, they just help you piece it all together to state your case. I've put other ones here. Again, I'm not gonna read them, but I think if you're writing and you're stuck, it might help you make your word choice more engaging. Because if you're using the same words again and again, it gets repetitive and it might not engage your reader as much. Okay, so these are just words that are helpful that you can use in both your introduction and your discussion, because as we're going to say, introduction and discussion is all about selling your story. Methods and results are reporting your study. Okay, so they're different in terms of their purpose. And make sure you use the appropriate scientific tone. Okay, you can't write like it's a report or like you're reading a textbook. So textbooks will just state facts. They'll say injecting lidocaine with adrenaline in fingers should be avoided because it causes necrosis. And then they just say that. And then you have to memorize it to answer questions in medical school, okay, or for your boards. Doesn't work for research articles. Research articles, everything is an assumption. Everything is a claim. We don't have any knowns. Everything is an unknown. So the way you'd reword it is you'd say, so-and-so have claimed that lidocaine with adrenaline may cause digital necrosis. Then you would put your citation. Then you'd say, but recently, so-and-so have disputed this claim. They carried out a prospective cohort study where people had their digits injected with lidocaine and demonstrated that none or 5% of their subjects experienced necrosis. So here I've created a controversy. So that's how I set the scene. I said, these people said this, these people did this. Oh, there's a gap in knowledge. So that's why I'm justifying my study, if that makes sense. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about introduction. The methods and results, I think, is more straightforward because you're just reporting what you did, okay, and explaining it briefly. So it's very factual. For methods, these are the common subheadings. Of course, it will vary per study. It will vary depending on your subject matter. But the most common things is you'd have a paragraph stating the design. So you'd say, this is a retrospective cohort study carried out in Mubarak al-Kabir Hospital between 1999 to 2003. Next, you'd talk about sample recruitment, and you might have a flow diagram to show how you recruited subjects. So you'd say, we recruited 300 people who presented at the diabetes clinic. We excluded people who are immunosuppressed, et cetera, and we defined people as diabetic based on their HbA1c, blah, blah, blah. So this is now, I've explained my recruitment. Next, you talk about group allocation. So if you had a treatment group and a control, or an exposure or no exposure, so you could say, so-and-so was allocated to receive steroids and so-and-so got placebo. This is where you'd explain it. And then last but not least, you talk about your outcomes or your endpoints. So what is your primary outcome that you were looking at? For example, we were looking at mortality. What was your secondary endpoint if you had them? And why did you select them? So you explain to your reader. And then you describe, how did I measure my outcomes? Did I use labs, questionnaires? I looked at death certificates. How did I get that information? And then the last section tends to be statistical analysis. So what software did you use? How did you summarize your results? How did you compare groups? What tests did you do? And how did you look at the difference in size of did you do odds ratios or whatever? And yeah, at the beginning, you'd also put a statement of ethics. So ethical approval was acquired, and this is the, by MOH Ethics Committee, for example. So writing the results, I would say if you're going to start making results, you should start with your tables and figures, which you should have already planned before starting your research paper, okay? As a general rule of thumb, table 1 is your baseline characteristics. So you're defining your group. So this is where you would say what percentage of people were male, female, what their ages were, what comorbidities they had. And then the rest of the tables will show your statistical tests. Okay. Make sure that when you label your figures, that it's comprehensive. And once you've made your figures and tables, you will just describe them. And make sure you refer to them in the main text, because I've seen some people make a table and then they don't mention it anywhere in the text, and that's a problem. So make sure that you always revert back and forth. So the way I do it is I usually just print the figures and tables, and then I go table 1 and I write a paragraph about it. Then I look at table 2, and then, again, methods and results is pure reporting. So it's very dry, and I think it's straightforward to do. Then it's writing the discussion, which I think most people, from what I've seen, seem to struggle with this the most, because it doesn't have as much of a defined format. So the way I would say you should think about it is change how you think about it. So I'd say, again, introduction and discussion, you are telling the story. So they go together. So if you're not sure how to frame your discussion, refer back to your introduction. And then methods and results, just report your study. And the aim of your discussion is placing your study in the wider context of your field, but you don't want to overstate your conclusion. You don't want to be like, yeah, we discovered something Nobel Prize winning. You have to be realistic with your discussion. But it's basically, okay, this is what we found out, so what? Basically, that's what you're answering. There is a common format that most people are following, and I think it's the format that's recommended by Cochrane. So basically, most people will re-summarize the results. In the discussion, you shouldn't put percentages and numbers as much, but just summarize the overall message. Then you'd have your overriding conclusion. You would talk a little bit about your limitations and what you plan for future study. So when we talk about what's the story, we have storyline types, okay? You could have, the most common one is calming for a circle. So we introduce ideas in the introduction, and now we're just gonna put them in the wider context. Does it match what other people said, or does it refute what they said, basically? Another thing you can do is a deep exploration. So you summarize all your findings, but you select one idea in the introduction to focus on, because from your results, this was the most interesting thing. And then the last method you can use to frame your story is a surprise insight. So, this is what we found out, but I'm still gonna introduce a new idea, not in the introduction. And this is less relevant for medicine, but you see it for social sciences, where we found this out, and now I'm gonna propose a new classification for this disease group, okay? So you're coming up with something totally different. For example, if I write a systematic review about RCTs, and then I come up with new guidelines. So this is a completely new idea that I came up with that I put in the discussion as a framework. When you talk about the limitations, okay, I suggest you take some time to do this, because people casually will put a limitation or two. And some people, there are 3 types of limitations. There's the confession, where people admit there's flaws in the study, but they don't critically discuss it. So they don't say why we made this flaw. They just say we did it, okay? And then there's people who are dismissive. So you acknowledge there's concerns, but say it's not important. What I suggest you do is the reflective approach. It's really the best approach, because basically what you're doing is highlighting aspects of the research design that may have created uncertainty about knowledge contribution, but you also explain why it matters and what you did about it. So that, things that you might highlight as limitations might be related to sample selection, setting, recruitment. And if you wanted to talk about this is the way I would suggest you format it. First, identify your main limitations, then describe each limitation and explain why it exists in the first place. For example, if my limitation is my sample size was picked from a single hospital in Kuwait, I would say this happened because this is where most of the cases were. And then you discuss what you did to address this limitation. So you might say that we think this is applicable to the general population because this is a representative sample. And then you assess how it impacted your results. So does it make it less generalizable to your general population or not? Once you have this, you just organize how would you describe them in your limitations. I think if you use a reflective approach and show that you're thoughtful, I think your reviewers will be more forgiving. Usually after I write all these things with my co-authors, then I look at the title. Usually you would have some title from your proposal, but then I think about, can I make it catchier? Can I make it more interesting? Because when an editor gets your manuscript, they might just read the title and abstract. And this is your opportunity to sell your research to the editor. Because once the editor, if they like your title and abstract, then they'll send it for review. If they hate it, you'll get a rejection within 24 hours. Usually it's pretty quick. So this is how they screen things. It's very rare that an editor is going to read your entire manuscript and make a decision. So I'd suggest you pay attention to this. Many ways to write a title. You can ask a question. For example, are medical students have sufficient grit, for example? You can have a title that provides an answer. For example, vitamin C is preventative for diabetes. You can present your author's position, highlight a research method. If you did an RCT, for example, you can be surprising. Some people use puns. I would suggest that, you know, even though you want to make your title interesting, you have to summarize or capture the essence of your article and make sure you have important keywords so that everyone gets it straight away. Next, I would write the abstract. Okay, and I know sometimes this is an afterthought, but again, this might be the only thing people read about your article on PubMed or as a journal editor. So taking time to make it thoughtful is important. You want it to be an accurate summary of your work, and you want to get the reader to want to read the rest of your work. So usually you follow the same format as the manuscript, but it's hard to say what the specific format is and the word count because every single journal is different. Some journals will ask you to also do a mini abstract or a visual abstract. So you just have to customize it to the journal itself. So again, for the introduction, if you just use the problem gap hook format, that's sufficient. For your methods, for your abstract, you want to establish credibility. So you want to at least state the study type and the scope and the scale of the study and what type of analysis you carried out. For the results, you're not going to put everything, but you can focus on the most exciting results that you center your discussion on. And your conclusion is usually just a sentence or two, which is your key take-home message and what it means for everyone else. One point I want to make about citations, you know, I work with some people that they handwrite their references. I hope nobody here does that. You have to use a reference manager. You have to use a reference manager. There's no excuse not to use a reference manager because there's tons of free options from Zotero to Mendeley. And the nice thing, if all the co-authors use the same one, you can actually share your references, which is great. You have EndNote and other ones which are paid. The only thing I don't like about EndNote is if I work with other authors and they don't have it and it's paid, then you can't share your references as efficiently. Whereas if you all agree on a reference manager, if someone edits, then it works seamlessly, I find. So I think it's nice to just agree on a reference manager from the outset that's easy to share and freely accessible to everyone. And then you would format your article. So I would suggest, like, every journal is different again. They all have different spacing requirements, font requirements. from the beginning, you should just have it in that format. So all journals require a title page. So these are the things that I listed that are in the title page: title, authors, contact details, keywords, funding detail, disclosure statements, acknowledgements. Then you have your abstract, then you have your main text, references, and usually figures and tables and appendices are at the end. Don't put your figures and tables in the main text. I think very few journals.
Apologies for the interruption. We'll be joining just in a moment. Once again, we'll be joining in a minute. So apologies for the disconnection.
Hello, sorry.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
Apologies, everyone, for the interruption.
Yeah, sorry. Troubleshooting. Okay. Did you catch me when I was talking about Grammarly?
I think if we can repeat that, it's better.
Okay. So the first issue I was talking about, like if you have issues with grammar or language. So Grammarly is a free software. You can download it for no cost, and it will automatically correct the grammar for you very well and suggest ways that you should rephrase sentences. So I suggest you add it. It's an add-on to Microsoft Word. If you require more professional services, you can find them online. So you can use Editage, but it's very expensive. So if you don't need to, you shouldn't. But if you're going to submit to a very high-end journal and you think this is a big issue for you, then it's possible to use it. They actually offer services where they will submit papers for you and do a lot. And Editage is run by former journal editors. The other thing to do is get as many of your co-editors to review as possible. Most of the grammar issues tend to be related to tenses from what I saw. So the convention is usually your introduction and discussion is in the present tense because you're presenting a current issue or a controversy, but the methods and results are usually done in the past tense. So it's just a reminder. The second problems that arise with writing papers is authorship. So I would suggest you decide beforehand who's going to be the author and what order it will be and who will be the corresponding author so it doesn't become an issue later. These are the Iccmge recommendations for authorship, and some journals will ask you to fill statements to say that all your authors meet these 4 criteria, that one, they've made a substantial contribution to design or data acquisition or data interpretation, that they've revised the work or drafted it, that they've approved the final version, and that they're accountable for all the work. Last issue is writer's block. So I know some people, it takes them a long time to get going with writing. I'd say it's helpful if you first know your literature, and this is where we talked about the post-it notes when starting. And the method that has been very helpful for me, because I struggled with this before, is the free writing methods. So the way it works is, first of all, you have to be relaxed and clear your mind with no distractions. Then you just set yourself a time limit for writing. So you're going to say between 7 to 8 p.m., I'm doing nothing except write. And you start the timer. Once this timer starts, you just write and you don't stop writing, even if you write garbage, okay? If you have nothing to write, you just write, I have nothing to write, I have nothing to write, I have nothing to write, until something comes up. And then, I know it sounds a little bit silly, but that's how it works. And then after the timer stops, you review what you wrote and you just extract things that sound good. And you keep doing this until you get, it's like a warm-up for your writing juices, okay? So, and it's a specific method that someone invented. Reasons you get writer's block is people aim for perfection in every sentence for their draft. So you just need to write enough to give you something to work with in the beginning. So don't aim for perfection, aim to just have something there. So imagine you're going to make a sculpture. You first need something to work with, which is the piece of clay. Then you can sculpt it and refine it and do, but don't aim for perfection. Sometimes I write my first draft like I'm having a conversation with a friend, okay? And I think it just helps you get something to start off with. Then the key is edit, 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 edit. So your first draft should just take 10% of your time or less, and 90% is spent editing. So you're better off writing something that looks nothing like the final product, and you spend all your time changing, reformatting, editing. So this is, I think, is key. So this is summary what we talked about. We talked about the preparation, the writing process, troubleshooting, and these are my recommended resources. For grammar, this is a classic, Strunk and White's The Elements of Style. It's very easy and quick to read. The free writing method, if you're interested in that, like I find it's the best thing that has helped my writing. It's a book by Peter Edwell called Writing with Power. Medical Writing, A Prescription for Clarity is an excellent book to practice having a good scientific tone. And then lastly, this book just came out. It's called Story Not Study, where most of this talk is derived. So I'd suggest buy it from Amazon or download any of these books. They're very helpful. And happy to take any questions.
I think we have a couple questions in the Q&A if you want to have a look. Or do you want me to read them?
Yeah, I don't see it. I don't know if when I logged in and out, if they disappeared for me.
I'll go ahead with the first question. Sure. We have a question regarding, should I seek ethical approval for conducting a secondary study? For example, a systematic review or a meta-analysis?
Yeah, I don't think, you don't need usually ethical approval for that. Sometimes you're in a gray zone, and if you're not sure, what I would suggest is you contact the ethics committee themselves and ask them. But at systematic reviews, you don't usually need ethical approval because the studies you're reviewing have already been approved by ethics, presumably. But what I would suggest is registering your study on Prospero before you start writing it, so that when you submit it, that's sometimes on the checklist for the journals.
Okay. And we have another question. If I have a new test idea for a research, what's the steps I need to do or be aware of in order to compare it to the gold standard test? Not interventional, only clinical exam.
Yeah, so you're talking about a diagnostics test compared to the gold standard. And what's the question about it, sorry?
If in general, if they have a new test idea for research, and what's the steps they need to be aware of?
So from a research design, most of these studies, you would run the test on like your subject matter, like your subjects, and then you would run the gold standard test, and then you would make a 2x2 table looking at like how many people tested positive or negative compared to your gold standard. And from a statistical perspective, usually you'd need to do a McNemar's test, for example. And then in terms of, so that's like in terms of design and analysis. And then in terms of writing it, it's the same format we said. So you would be in the introduction, trying to justify why this test is better than the old test. Because if it's more expensive or it's less accurate, why are you even studying it, right? So you'd have to say that, for example, currently we're using MRI, which is very expensive with limited access, and it takes a long time, and some people are claustrophobic. So this new test that I'm interested in is, so-and-so have showed that it's a lot cheaper by this much and that it's easier to run, it's more accessible. Therefore, my study is looking at validating whether the sensitivity and specificity of this test compared to the whatever test you're comparing it to. And then if you're writing your discussion, you would say, for example, this is the first study to look at it, or other studies have looked at it, but didn't look at such a large number of patients. So you'd explain like how it fits in with the existing literature, if that's helpful.
Perfect. We have a couple of questions about case reports. One question is about how do they approach the case report in the same way? And is there any tips for case reports?
Yeah, so case reports, I would say before you write the case report, decide where you're submitting it to, because the main journals are not publishing case reports as much as they used to. And now there's journals specific for case reports where it might be helpful to target those. And each of them will have a specific format. So the best way to prepare for a case report is to, from as soon as you see the patient that you're interested in, getting their ethics, because some journals will ask for the patient's signature on a consent form. They need to see it. Make sure you take the photos ahead of time, because I've seen people try to write a case report and the patient gets lost to follow up. So they never have the complete picture. And good case reports do have good follow-up. You might have photos of histology. So this is all planning ahead, because if you decide to write a case report 4 months later, it's a lot more difficult. And then you're stuck with it, and then you don't know where to publish it. So I think case reports nowadays, if you want to get into a good journal, it's a good idea to have videos. So multimedia, like, recently tried to publish an article, and I think the only reason it got in is it had a good video. So using multimedia to its fullest extent will help you get into a more interesting journal because people are more willing to read it. The format itself tends to start with like a brief patient history, like the introduction is this novel? Like some people write a case report, but there's already hundreds of case reports, so it's not usually worth your time. But if it's truly rare, then your introduction will explain why this case report is worth reporting. Then you would have the patient's story, so their history, their physical exam, their labs, what happened. And at the end, you would have a discussion of what does this mean to our clinical practice. So that tends to be the format. But I would say that the main challenge with publishing case reports is finding a journal that takes case reports nowadays. And most of them are open access, so you have to pay a lot of money. Mm-hmm.
Perfect. We're having a couple more questions that are coming in. We have a question. If somebody edits your manuscript or reviews it when you talked about grammar, does that need to be acknowledged or credited in the paper itself, or especially in a context where a lot of edits have been made?
You mean if someone only edited your paper but didn't meet the other criteria for authorship? I mean, if someone was not involved in the design or the analysis or the collection, then I mean, it's up to you, honestly, and your co-authors. But technically speaking, which we don't always follow, that means they meet the requirements for an acknowledgement, and maybe you send them a nice present to say thank you, but you're not obliged to make them an author, but you might decide to for other reasons. Because when we talk about co-authorship, there's a lot of controversy, and we're not necessarily meeting the Iccmge guidelines strictly, even though we're supposed to.
Perfect. And we have another question. What is a research protocol? Is it similar to the proposal or a draft? I was asked to write it by my professor before starting my research internship.
Yeah, so research proposal is similar to a research protocol. However, it depends on the type of research you're doing. So a protocol specifies exactly what you're going to do. I would say it is a proposal unless you're doing an RCT. If you're doing an RCT, the protocol tends to be very long, like sometimes over 100 pages. And it has a lot of detail. So it would start the same, like an introduction. But then when you talk about your sample selection, defining your primary and secondary endpoint, it gets a lot of more detail. And if you're studying a drug, then in your introduction, you have to add other things. For example, you're going to need to specify what were if you're doing a phase 3 trial and your phase 1 and 2, you did the dosing studies and the safety studies. So you would be talking about them and you'd have extra sections. So in your outcomes, you'd get a lot more detail because you need to talk about serious adverse events or other things. So I would say the best way to start if you have to write a research protocol, and again, this is clinical research. There is also protocols for basic science research. And basic science research is a whole different game, right? So the best way to start is to look for protocols that are similar to what you're trying to do to get an idea of the format if you haven't done it before. And if you have a research supervisor, you can ask prior research associates or students in the field to show you like their thesis or protocol, just to give you an idea of it, because all science is really protocol driven. So it's basically an accurate way of specifying your methods.
Perfect. And we have a lot of questions that are coming in. So we have a follow-up question regarding the acknowledgement. what about just official acknowledgement in the acknowledgement section? So I guess they want to find out which people go in that area and if they have to put certain people in there.
Yeah, it's really, I think it's always better to decide beforehand what, who goes where, so you don't get into conflict with people, because this is a source of conflict. But I think that anyone who contributed to study who does not meet the Iccmge criteria is automatically merits an acknowledgement, because you have to acknowledge that they did something, but they didn't do enough to become an author. So this is where they slot in. So you either meet Iccmge criteria, so you're an author. You don't meet Iccmge criteria, but you did something, like you edited or you provided samples or you did some laboratory work. So then you get acknowledged. And then if you did nothing, then you should not be anywhere, if that makes sense.
It does. And we have a question regarding video or picture journals. So I think there's specific journals for that, but they want to know more regarding those journals.
Yeah, I think if you're gonna choose a journal, we talk about it in the next part, but at least your journal should be an SJR. At least it should be not a predatory journal if you're gonna choose it. New England Journal of Medicine, for example, has a very high impact factor 70, and they do accept, for example, video admissions or photo admissions, same as BMJ case report. So they will all have specific criteria. So they will have specific criteria of what is acceptable for a multimedia submission. They might have a specific size or a specific format. They will only accept, I don't know, TIFF format, or so it's helpful to know ahead of time, because it's hard to convert. So I would suggest, if you like that kind of articles, to get an SLR camera, because you can define what ISO it is, and then it will give you things in a TIFF format, which you can convert to many other formats. But if you just have a JPEG, then you're in big trouble, because you can't convert to the other formats. With videos, decide what kind of a video. Are you just showing clinical signs, or are you telling a story? So sound quality is very important. If you have a narration, make sure they have good English. Make sure that if you're going to use multimedia, that it's high quality. And if you're not sure, you can always email the editor ahead of time to ask if they don't give you clear specifications. If you have to make a visual abstract, the software I'd recommend is Canva, CANVA, and it's very good for making mini cartoons. There's also another one that's very good for scientific articles that I forgot the name, so that's not helpful. But if anyone is interested, just email me. I'm happy to direct you to it. But it also has lots of graphics that you can use for illustrations.
Perfect. We have a couple questions for medical students. One is asking what type of research would be better suited for a medical student, especially that randomized control trials are hard to get in or hard to find?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think from what I've seen, most residents or medical students want a study that has a fast turnaround, because you want to publish something before you apply for postgraduate training, or like you want something to help your CV. So things that you can bang out quickly are definitely systematic reviews, because you don't have to wait for ethics or anything like that. Surveys and questionnaires are overdone, but they're pretty quick, because you send them and then you can analyze them. Chart reviews take more time and you need ethics, but it's good to get involved. And if you can get involved in an RCT, even doing a small part, and it gets published years later, I think it's still a good experience. So I would say it's good to try a little bit of everything, so that once you're reading and critiquing articles, if you've gone through the process, you understand the entire thing better. But if you're going to pick a study, just think about what's the follow-up going to be. If you're going to do anything prospective, if you're going to look at scarring and you're going to look at scars a year later, that's going to take a really long time. So I think if you're looking for quick gains, then you want articles with a short timeline in terms of follow-up and in terms of logistically doing it, basically. And ideally, I think you want articles that are also not as resource intensive, because you're always better off if you're going to be a more senior author or first author. If you're doing a project with 50 people, then you just get diluted, I think. So it's good to have a mix, but you need things that you can own, basically.
Great. And we have another question. As a beginner, how can I estimate the scientific value of my proposed research?
Yeah, like I said in the beginning, you have to read a lot of articles and go to many conferences to understand if something is valuable or not. If you don't know the literature in the area, and you can't know everything, but that's why PhD questions, for example, are very focused. Okay, you can decide that I want to gain expertise. Like, you can't say all of medicine, like you have to be specific. So medullary thyroid cancer chemotherapy treatment. So in that area, you have to read a lot to understand what are the gaps in knowledge, and if you have an idea for something, like, oh, I have an idea for a better dressing protocol, then you would have to go to the literature and read almost everything in that subject area and make notes and summarize it to understand, if I look into this, is it going to add value, or has someone done it? And is anyone even interested in it? Because sometimes if you search your topic, if there's only 3 articles in it, it means it doesn't have a wide audience. And that's why if you look at the top funded research in the States, for example, it's Alzheimer's and cancer, for example, because those are things people are interested in. Now, it doesn't mean that niche areas are not interesting, but they will probably have a more limited audience, and it will probably get into a less impactful journal for a wide audience, but maybe your audience is limited. For example, I'm in plastic surgery. I'm never going to do Cell Nature Science papers, probably, because my audience is very niche. Okay, I hope that answers that.
We have a question. I would like to submit. I would submit an abstract for a conference, but was rejected in the first time. So, is it ethical to reformulate my research question to resubmit it again to the conference?
Yeah, if you think your issue, of course it's ethical. There's nothing unethical about trying again. But I guess it depends on why do you think it was rejected in the first place. If you think the English and grammar was an issue and you're trying to resubmit it to fix that, I think that's fine. But what I would actually do is email the conference people themselves, the organizers, and say, would you mind if, like, I found many flaws with how I wrote the abstract. Do you mind if I resubmit my abstract again? Because, I mean, they might see that it's the same person sending the same thing, and then you will look silly because they'll think, does this person not see that we can see that they submit the same thing twice, but changed it a little bit? So I think it makes more sense to me to ask first, to say, and you can ask, like, I doubt they'd reply if you ask for feedback if it's a huge conference, but if it's a small one, they might tell you, actually, we're just not interested in the subject area. Maybe it's the wrong audience and it's a better fit for a different conference. So I think, first of all, you have to decide, why did they reject it? They just might not be interested. So why resubmit the same thing again, I guess? Because if it got reviewed, then they might have feedback. But if it got rejected quickly, it just might not be what they're looking for at that time point.
Perfect. And we have one question regarding, do you happen to know any research journals that give research opportunities to medical students?
Research journals don't usually give you research opportunities because that's not really their purpose. So usually the journal itself, let's say it's sponsored by Springer or Science Direct, they would offer a scientist the position of editor, and then you'd have deputy editors, but they're actually scientists themselves in different lab. So a strategy might be that if you look through the journal itself and you see the names of the editors and the sub-editors and you like the research they're doing, you can just email them and ask for research opportunities directly. So you can say, journals offer jobs. So they offer job postings if you want to be involved as a medical journalist in some journals. It's not that common. The other opportunities journal offer you is if you want to be a reviewer. So some journals have things specific for medical students. You can be a journal ambassador or a social media ambassador. So you can email the editor and say, I'd like to be involved in your journal. Do you have any volunteer opportunities to be a social media contributor or something like that? And that just gets you involved with the editorial team at least. So that's how one of my friends, for example, became deputy editor for the aesthetic surgery journal. He just emailed and asked, can I help you with social media? And they said, sure, you can be a social media editor. If you're looking for opportunities for research, I would suggest there's always lab directories or listings if you know what area you're interested in. It could be within your medical schools or other medical schools. You can always approach academics if you think their work is interesting, because most academics are looking for people to help and hopefully teach as well, not just help in terms of getting research done.
I think this leads us to the next question. Is there any websites out there that we could sign up as a data collector? If you want to suggest any.
Yeah, there's many strategies you can take about this. The easiest one is to look at research collaborative. So it depends on your area of research. For example, if you are in surgery, there's different surgical collaboratives. There's the GI surgical group. So as anyone can sign up, and you've seen this with COVID surge, for example, but there's trainee-led research collaboratives. They're very popular in the UK. So you can Google and they will come up, and then all you do is data collection. If that's something you're interested in, if there's ongoing work that you know of that's listed on clinicaltrials.gov or something, you can always ask to volunteer. I know that especially outside Kuwait, they're always looking for people who can act as clinical research associates, in which their job will be doing data collection. But I think it's more fruitful to be involved in all aspects. Data collection is a good exercise. It teaches you patience, but it's good to also be involved in the design and the writing process, just so you can have a comprehensive overview. Many societies within your field will have lab listings. So if you're interested in, transplant surgery, just Google transplant surgery, lab directory, or research projects, and lots of things will come up. If that doesn't work for you, if you read any article that you like the work, the corresponding author's email is always available, and you can just email them and say, I read your work, I find it really interesting. Are there any opportunities to do more research with you? The worst thing they can do is ignore you. And they might say, yeah, for sure. And then you, gain a research mentor.
Perfect. And I think we've went through a lot of questions. We'll take one more. And if a journal took too much time to respond regarding a publication, is it possible to submit to more than one without being ethically non-acceptable?
No,
do you have to wait?
No, you can't do that. If you submit to a journal, you've committed to that journal. And people have to be realistic, because I heard someone complaining that they were waiting 3 months, but 3 months is normal. No one's going to respond to you in like 2-3 weeks. Sometimes journals can take 6 months to a year. You can't submit something you've submitted somewhere to somewhere else. That's like a really bad thing to do. What you can do is email the editor and ask, I'm just checking to know like what's the status. And what happens is that the editor, if they decide that they're interested in your article, they have to find people willing to review your article. So let's say they email someone and they say no. Then they'll email someone else and then listen. And then maybe the third person said, sure, I'll review it. Then they have to find a second reviewer. Okay, let's say the two reviewers reviewed your article and one said it's great and one said it's horrible. Oh, wait, I have to find a third reviewer. And then the third reviewer is neutral, so they have to find a fourth reviewer to review it. So, and then for the fourth reviewer, they might email 10 people and the 11th person responds. So that's why it takes a while. And I don't know, people who have reviewed articles, like when I've had a request to review it, sometimes I forget. It might take me like a month to review an article because it's not a priority for me. When we review articles, we do it as a courtesy. It's not a paid job, right? Most editors do their work for free. Deputy editors do it for free, and then reviewers are doing the work for free. So we all depend on our good grace, and it can take a long time sometimes because it's just the way it is. But you should never submit something that you've already submitted somewhere. I think that's if both accept you, then you're in big trouble. Like, yeah, I don't think that's a good idea.
Exactly. And would it be the same regarding a conference? I don't.
Yeah, because when you submit to a conference, you sign a paper usually that says, I'm not submitting this anywhere else. So you have a written agreement with both the journal and the abstract.
Exactly. Just to clarify for the audience, I think we've went through many questions. Thank you, Dr. Sarah, for your time responding to each one of them. And thank you for the session. It's always a pleasure to have you with us. And I'm looking forward regarding the last session of the series of our ABCs of Research series, which will be on how to publish a paper. Thank you everyone for attending today. If you haven't registered already regarding the last session, you can register using the links in the chat. And before I put the QR codes, I would like to play a video regarding our new upcoming series. I hope everyone's excited as I am for the series. Once again, thank you everyone for attending today. And as usual, we have our QR codes up. You can register using the links in the chat, or you can pull up your phone and scan the codes. For our next session on ABCs of Research will be on how to publish a paper, which will be on the 22nd of July. And we'll be resuming our next session of Surgical Fix series, which will be on motility disorders, given by Dr. Alexander Lee this Sunday. And you can also register for the surgical debate. And for the video we just played, we have the link in the chat regarding the Plastic Surgery Foundation course, which is once again a CME accredited series by the American College of Surgeons, which will be an interactive online course made of 8 webinars. And you can register for all the sessions using the link in the chat. Just make sure that you check the boxes for the sessions and you'll receive an email with a link to access. Thank you again, and thank you, Dr. Sarah, for giving us your time, and looking to see you all in our next sessions.